Hi, and welcome to your very first class for Child in Society, which is going to provide you an introduction to the course and the topic as a whole. And we're going to just dive right in. Childhood is a social construct, which is a very simple, straightforward statement. Even though it's a very short statement, it can easily lead to a really complicated discussion with a whole range of factors involved because of what a social construct is. A social construct is a social creation subject to redefinition by the culture or society that attempts to define it. Sounds really academic. So what this means is that it's not natural, it's not naturally occurring, it's created by the society within which it exists. So we shape what social constructs there are in society, but at the same time, they shape us. So depending on the society in which it exists, in which it's being considered, the definition of something will vary. I find a really clear example of this is looking at masculinity and femininity. A society likes to tell us what is feminine or masculine and how each of these can be displayed, or what we perceive as indications of femininity or masculinity. Historically speaking, the values tied to masculinity have been generally seen as superior than those associated with femininity. But that's shifted from what it was 100 years ago. Deviant behavior is extremely relevant. It is completely dependent on what a society defines as deviant. One society may consider something to be wrong or different, while another may not. In some societies, it is considered a norm, an accepted norm, to force sexual relations on a female marital partner, not deviant at all. In some societies, anything other than a heterosexual relationship is considered deviant, while in others it's not. In some societies, it's considered deviant for a woman to show any skin above the ankles, but in others it's not. These are all examples of a social construction, a social creation subject to redefinition by the culture or society that attempts to define it. It is not natural, it is created by society. So we shape what social constructs there are, but then in return, they also shape us. And childhood as a concept is a social construction. What childhood is or means will vary dependent on the country or society or culture one lives in. Perceptions of what childhood should be and what a child is will vary. It will vary depending on the particular point in history we're looking at and what the society is like. It will vary depending on what has occurred previously, historically speaking, and what is occurring in that society at that time. It will vary depending on the economic structure of that society and the cultural context of that society, and the religious context of that society, and how gender is perceived, and so on. For example, for 2 years, the international study of children's well-being has been taking place, starting actually collecting data in 2017 after over a year of preparation, and with the goal of collecting information about children's daily lives, what they typically do on a daily basis. But what's different about this study is that it seeks information from children themselves. Specifically, the study, quote, aims to collect solid and representative data on children's lives and daily activities, their time use, and in particular, their own perceptions and evaluations of their well-being, end quote. This basic questionnaire was adapted from 3 age groups: 8 years old, 10 years old, and 12 years old. So there's 3 versions of it, one for each age group. And there's not a lot of difference between the different versions, but they do take the age differences into account. For example, the questionnaire for 8-year-olds is the shortest, and each successive one is a bit longer. The one for 8-year-olds uses a scale of emoticons in one part, while the others don't. With this study, so far 24 countries have participated, with 90,000 children taking part. And another 40 countries are participating in the next wave. So this is massive. So far, results have indicated certain general differences in the experience of childhood. In Europe, there are greater differences in how young people feel about themselves as they become teenagers. Often girls feel less positive about themselves than boys in terms of their looks. However, the researchers found that in particular African countries and in Colombia, these gender differences just don't exist. Girls are as happy with the way they look as boys are. In a number of European countries, one of the areas that young people were least positive about was school. But in Africa and Nepal, young people were more likely to say that they like going to school. Now, we can also get a little more specific here and recognize that what constitutes a normal childhood depends on where you live as well as where you were born. That's going to define what your sense of normal is. Children on the Pacific island of Tonga are regularly beaten by their parents and by their older siblings because parents believe that social competence can only be achieved through discipline and physical punishment, and they treat their children in ways that might seem very harsh to outsiders. In the Fulani tribe of West Africa, girls are expected to be able to care for their younger siblings, fetch water and firewood by age 4. And by the age of 6, they will be pounding grain, producing milk and butter, and selling these alongside their mothers in the market. There is a small ethnic group in West Africa called the Beng, Beng, and they assume that even very young children know and understand everything that is said to them in whatever language they are addressed, because they believe all children live in a spirit world before they are born, and thus know all human languages and understand all cultures. When they are still part of the spirit world before birth, life is nice, it's pleasant, they have a lot of friends there, and they're often very reluctant to leave it for an earthly family. So the Bing believe when a child is born that they remain in contact with this other world for several years and may decide to return there if they're not properly looked after. So parents treat young children with great care so that they're not tempted to return, and also with a certain degree of respect because they're in contact with the spirit world in a way adults are not. Then you have the majority of Western countries, Canada included, who tend to view children as pretty incompetent and completely dependent on the adults around them. Unlike the Fulani, who expect 4-year-olds to insist in caring for siblings, we would never expect that in any way. In fact, we have laws against somebody working when they're too young. So when we study childhood, yes, we're studying the children who occupy childhood, who are in fact children. But we are really studying the cultural ideas that make up that construct of what childhood is. Now, we could take this a step further, and as the text explains, even the definition of what a child is will vary. Not just between societies and cultures, but within a single culture, depending on who you ask. How would you define what a child is? You might think in a modern, westernized country like Canada that's relatively stable, that we have a specific, widely agreed upon definition of childhood, but we don't. Statistics Canada defines a child as the offspring of any age residing with their parents or grandparents, as long as that offspring does not also have their own offspring or spouse living with them in their parents' home. So if you lived with your parents or grandparents once you have your own children, or once you're in a married or common law relationship, Statistics Canada will no longer view you as a child, even though you're living with your parents. But if you moved back home after university and were single and did not have any children yourself, you would still be considered a child by StatsCan. So how does StatsCan define what a child is? Do they define a child based on the maturity or their physical maturity or their chronological age? No, they don't. Statistics Canada defines a child based on living arrangements and interdependency. In other words, according to Statistics Canada, you're an adult when you no longer live with your parents or have or live with a partner of your own or have or live with a child of your own. Age has nothing to do with it. They don't refer to age, which is kind of odd. Um, the Criminal Code of Canada takes a different approach regarding defining what a child is in relation to sexual activity specifically, and the ability to make decisions regarding sexual activity. Up until 2007, our criminal code said that anybody under 14 was considered a child. In 2007, that age was changed to 16. This means then that sexual activity with a person under the age of 16, whether male or female, is considered a criminal offense because they are viewed as a child by our criminal code and thus do not possess the maturity to consent to sexual activity of any kind. They may willingly consent. For all intents and purposes, willingly consent. They may not be forced or coerced, but the fact is their consent is not considered real consent under the law because the law says they are too young to fully understand what they are consenting to. So a 15-year-old consenting to sexual activity, well, no, they're not consenting according to Canadian law. Now, there may be extenuating circumstances. This shows the age of consent in different places in the States. So there may be extenuating circumstances. If the person involved is very close in age to the child themselves, or is a child themselves, it may be viewed differently. So two grade 9 students who are both 15, or a 15-year-old who is still technically a child according to the law, and a 16-year-old who isn't. So one exception to the law allows a minor aged 12 or 13 to consent to be with an individual less than 2 years older, although this is always considered on an individual basis. The other exception in our criminal code allows 14 to 16-year-olds to consent to partners less than 5 years older. And the age of consent in Canada is raised to 18, not 16, if the older party is in a position of trust over the other, the younger party is in a relationship of dependency with the older party, or if the relationship is exploitive. And there's different consent laws for different kinds of sexual acts. Anal intercourse is considered a crime unless it occurs with a married couple or two people over the age of 18. But if a third person is present when anal intercourse occurs, or it does not take place in private, it's considered a crime. The point here is that our Canadian Criminal Code, or at least part of it, defines a child based on their age chronologically, just age, very straightforward. But Statistics Canada doesn't even refer to age. There are even differences within Canada's criminal code regarding age, because if you look at laws regarding pornography, child pornography refers to anybody under the age of 18 or who is made up to look like they're under 18, not 16, which is the age of consent. And the fact is, people often look younger than they really are. This is why in your late teens and into your 20s, you are carded on a regular basis in order to buy alcohol. Because drinking establishments want to make sure they're not serving anybody who's underage because they could lose their liquor license. So you can engage in sexual activity privately with somebody who's 16, but something is considered child pornography if they are under 18 or depicted as being under 18. If a 21-year-old who looks like they are 15 participates in producing pornography, that is actually against the law. You can legally engage in sexual intercourse at 16, but can't take sexual pictures for the purposes of sale or create any kind of sexual video. Again, when it comes to pornography, the basis is chronological age. So far then, StatsCan defines a child based on their living arrangements and interdependency, not age. Our criminal code in general defines a child based on chronological age, very straightforward. And the specific part of the criminal code focused on child pornography also defines a child based on age, but a different chronological age, and also takes appearance into account if you're made to look underage. So it's not as straightforward as you might think, is it? If we look at defining a child specifically in relation to their parents, well, if you're thinking this was going to be consistent, it's not. Maybe you've watched TV shows or movies where a parent is arguing with their teenager and they yell at them, "If you live in my house, you follow my rules." Or the teen yells, "When I turn 18, I'm totally out of here," implying that as soon as they are legally allowed to leave their parents' home and live on their own, they will. That they have to be 18 to be considered an adult and able to live on their own. Well, according to Immigration Canada, parents are obligated to look after their children and provide for them until 16. So if you immigrate to Canada from another country with children, you are responsible for them until the age of 16. But the Ontario Child and Family Services Act states that a child is anybody under the age of 18. And just to complicate this even further, there is no consistency in Canada, not at all, because all provinces and territories are not the same. In British Columbia, Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia, the Yukon, and Newfoundland and Labrador, it's 19. Because in Canada, child and family services are considered a provincial matter under provincial jurisdiction, not a federal matter. Just like the standard curriculum followed in public schools falls under provincial jurisdiction. So depending what province or territory you are in, what you study in each grade might change depending where you are. And I always find this surprising, whether it's in regards to a standard curriculum or something considerably more serious like child and family services, that our country has not been able to maintain some kind of consistency. And this is a pretty basic issue, a pretty basic thing to define, but it has an enormous effect and sometimes a pretty serious effect. Even for something as simple as a driver's license, viewed by the majority of people as a sign of maturity and kind of like a rite of passage into pre-adulthood, the age at when this can legally occur varies in Canada. In Alberta, you have to be 14 to get your learner's permit. In the rest of Canada, it's 16. Now in Quebec, at 14, you can get a farm tractor license or a scooter license. So let me bring all of this back to my main point, that the term childhood and child are socially constructed. They are a social creation, subject to redefinition by the culture or society that attempts to define it. So what it means to be a child, including the expectations we have of a child. How they should look, how they should act, what they should do, what their interests should be, all of it will vary. Depending on what part of Canada you are in, what it means to be considered a child is dependent on chronological age, or level of maturity, at least perceived level of maturity, or economic independence, or a combination of these. Depending on what your need for the definition is, do you have a legal need, a tax-related need for Statistics Canada or Revenue Canada, a social services related need with child and family services, or a driving related need? The behavior that we typically expect during the stage of childhood is socially constructed according to the society in which we live. The experiences we expect one to have during this stage of life are socially constructed. And what we expect of children during childhood is socially constructed. So if our social construction of what childhood is, or what a child is, varies within Canada, just imagine how much variation there is comparing Canada now to Canada 100 years ago. Think of the year you were born and then deduct 100 years. So this is me when I was probably about 3, sitting on my mom's kitchen table. I was born in 1971. If I had been born in 1871, my experience as a child would have been incredibly different. And the expectations people had of me would have been incredibly different as well. Society would have been much more agricultural in nature as a whole. The very manner in which society was organized would have been different. If the socioeconomic status of my family was different, that would have affected both the experiences I had and people's expectations of me. And because I'm a female, gender norms and expectations would have been different as well. In your text, there's a quote that reads, different societies carry different conceptions of childhood, which in turn influence the experience of children themselves. This is 100% true and nicely summarizes everything I've said so far. A good way to illustrate the social construction of childhood is to take a comparative approach. That is, to look at how children are seen and treated at other points in history, as I said, or in other places in the world right now, as I did at the start of class. If we take a historical approach, many people have done this. They kind of section history into different periods of time. Children and childhood during colonial America or during the Middle Ages. Others have preferred to try to examine specific trends across several historical periods. So, like educational expectations across hundreds of years. No matter what approach is taken, accurately studying and assessing and coming to reasonable conclusions about childhood is difficult when we look back in history. Because historically speaking, children did not leave a lot of direct clues about their life was like. We have an idea, but not from children themselves, so the information we have is filtered. For example, looking back in history, let's say I wanted to research the daily lived experiences of young adults aged 20 to 30 in colonial Canada from 1850 to 1900. How would I do that? Well, I would do that by looking for several different kinds of information. Birth records, marriage certificates, death records, birth records indicating parenthood, not their own birth, employment records, maybe land titles, any kind of ownership papers, any court records of any kind. I would look through wills that have been filed. But other than a birth certificate, none of this information would provide me much information about childhood at that time. Okay, well, how about looking through church records? If a church kept a written account of church membership or church attendance, or people who donated, or any other kind of town records. Again, none of this information would provide me much information about childhood at that time. I could search for any kind of travel log. For example, a ship's log would indicate who was on board, what their position was, how much they were paid, how long they were a member of the crew. Again, this is not going to provide me much information about childhood at the time. I could look through pictures and see if I could actually identify anybody or even just to gain information from the pictures themselves, how they were dressed, for example. This might provide some information about childhood, but not much. I could look through diaries or journals that have been kept, which you can in fact do at the provincial archives and the national archives. Often they're on microfiche, so essentially you're just looking at slides, but sometimes they even just hand over the actual diaries. I might take more of an anthropological approach and review artifacts that have either been purposely kept or found, newspapers, even garbage. But the vast majority of the examples I just gave you will not apply to learning anything about childhood directly from children. How often do people come across the diary of a 10-year-old or a 6-year-old, or letters that they had written completely independently? How often would there have been legal records regarding children or economic records? For the most part, historically speaking, even in Canada, the education level of children were very low, and at one point it was common for kids to be completely illiterate. Well, if you can't read or write, you're not going to keep a diary or journal or write letters to people. So it was extremely, extremely rare for a child to be mentioned in any kind of legal document. And there's a very important distinction we have to make here. We can try to understand childhood from an adult perspective. That's totally fine. But that is very, very different from the lived experience of childhood at that time, because the adult reporting is filtering the information provided, whether they realize it or not. Have you ever been talking to your parents or another family member about something that occurred when you were younger and their memory of it is completely, completely different from yours? Of course you have. Mom, you were so tough on me that day when I really didn't do anything wrong at all. And your mom says, oh, I wasn't that tough on you at all. Her memory of disciplining you is very different from your memory of that experience. My memory of what I was like as a teenager is different from my mom's memory of what I was like as a teenager regarding how difficult I was or wasn't. And this is extremely important. Yeah, we can look at what the social norms were at the time. We can look at various adult accounts, various adult documents, various adult diaries about something involving a child. Maybe school records if they're available. But that is the adult's perception, not the child's. It's based on the adult's memories, not the child's. How a society remembers something or how a person remembers something is not necessarily the same as the person or people who actually experienced it, who actually went through it. And not only is the adult perception based on their own memory of how a child experienced life, in addition to being their own perspective, it might not be accurate. It may be a little off, or totally off, or somewhere in between. And I don't mean that in a malicious way, it's just that they remember it differently. This applies to every part of childhood, including the mundane, everyday parts, but I think discipline is the best example. And again, maybe you've experienced this yourself. I'll bug my mom or tease her about how she just stood by and let my brothers be mean to me. She didn't do anything and she should have done more. And she'll tell me, Jennifer, that's not what happened at all. I have my own memories of how I was disciplined when I was growing up, but those memories are not the same as my mom's because she had a different perspective. But if somebody in the future was researching the experience of childhood in the 1970s, and all they had to go on was my mom's memories, that is what they'd have to go on. My experience of childhood would be distorted by my mom, not necessarily intentionally or maliciously, but my experience of childhood would be reported through the lens of my mom's memory. So although this sounds a little overly dramatic, in a sense, this means that the experience of childhood, historically speaking, is based on children who were in large part silenced in reporting about their own experiences because they had no manner of documenting or reporting their experiences themselves. So we have nothing to refer to that is directly from them and not through somebody else's filter.